I want to use two remotes to trigger the same set of lights. Why would I want to do that? Well, perhaps I'm at an event and I have a second photographer, but I'd like to change the settings on the lights and have the same exposure on the second camera without them changing them too. And in the same way, perhaps we're at a workshop and it's not about lighting, so I want to set the lights and allow the other photographers access to those lights without changing the settings. The main reason I like to use two triggers with one flash is when I'm using a digital camera and a film camera at the same time. I use the digital camera like a Polaroid to test the lights and make sure they're exactly how I like them, and then I want to seamlessly move to the film camera and take a couple of shots without changing the settings on the light. The lighting system I'm using is the godox set of lights, also branded as flashpoint, with the R2 radio transmitter. And there are some fancier ones that do through the lens metering, and you can tell which ones those are because they'll have multiple pins dependent on the brand of camera that you're using. Or you can get the simpler triggers, the one pin triggers like this, that does exactly the same thing, except there's no through the lens metering. Instead, it only receives one signal through a single pin, and it can pretty much work on any camera with a hot shoe mount. For the most part, these triggers work in the same way, other than the TTL function, and you can use them interchangeably. So why can't we use two triggers at the same time just as they are? These triggers are set to the same channel, and along with this strobe, they're all set to group E. So if I fire with this first trigger set at 128th, it'll fire the flash, and this one will do exactly the same thing because it's also set to a 128th. But what happens if I change the power up on the first unit? I'll change this one up to an 1/8 and fire the flash, and you can see the flash is now firing at an 1/8. But if I use a second strobe, it'll fire at an 1/8 for the first press, but then on the second press, the strobe has registered the signal from the second one at 128th and has returned to that value. If I go back to the first one, it'll fire at 128th first, and then it'll go back to the 1/8 power that it's now transmitting. If two photographers were using this at the same time, they'd be constantly overriding each other's settings. So the easiest way to do this is to set a primary trigger and a secondary trigger. The primary one we can leave alone. That one's going to determine the power setting of the flash. But the second one we're going to set to trigger only, and it'll no longer be able to change the power of the light. And to do that, we simply find this GR button at the top left, press and hold until the screen says app. It's designed to communicate with a smartphone app, but in this instance, it'll just tell the flash to fire without giving it any information about the power setting to fire with. You can use any remote you'd like as the primary trigger, but as far as I'm aware, only these flashpoint R2 single pin transceivers can be used as the secondary triggers in this way. So now if the primary remote is set to a 16th, it will fire at a 16th, and the secondary remote will also fire at a 16th. We change the primary up to a 1/4, the flash will fire at a 1/4, and so will the secondary trigger. And when the day's done and you want that secondary trigger to go back to a normal mode, you press and hold the GR button and it's back. If you occasionally use film cameras like I do, there are a couple of ways that you can attach a trigger to the camera. The first of which, with relatively new film cameras, is that they've got a hot shoe on top and you can attach the trigger just like you would on a modern digital camera. There are some cameras like the Stereo Realist where it looks like it's got a hot shoe, but the bump where the single pin connection goes is really high and there's no physical way to get the connector in there. So much older cameras didn't have hot shoes, but on the side you'll see a couple of ports. These are the PC ports, and sometimes there's a pair of them. One will be called X, the other might be called S, M, F, FP, to be used with older flashes that took a fraction of a second to warm up before it reached its peak illumination. But X is for modern flashes that reach their peak illumination much sooner. So to fire cameras like that, you'll need a PC port adapter with a PC port on one end and a jack on the other, and you plug the jack into the sync part of your remote and the PC port into the camera. Now there are a couple of issues you might run into, especially if you've got a cold shoe on a camera that's entirely made of metal, because the single pin on the remote, when it touches the metal, will fire the flash. And the way around that is to use a PC port to hot shoe adapter. I can only find these available from Impact on the B&H website. And it's a case of putting the adapter onto the cold shoe and connecting it up to the PC sync port, and then putting your trigger into that. It's a bulky setup, but it works pretty well. Quite often I'm using 2 remotes to trigger one light, and if you're doing the same thing, let me know the reasons in the comments below, and if you found any novel solutions to get the job done.